I'm Elizabeth Donahue, and I run public affairs here at the Woodrow Wilson School. And I'm honored today to introduce A. Scott Berg, who will join us for a discussion of his new biography, Wilson, which examines the 28th President of the United States, as well as our namesake. It's already a New York Times bestseller, and the book takes a fresh look at the former president and explores the emotional and personal side of him. As I like to say, I think it's a clear-eyed view of the president, both the good parts of him as well as the bad, if you will. And I think today we'll hear a very good, honest assessment of our namesake. Today's moderator is Julian Zelizer, who many of you know. He has done a number of events here, so we're always grateful when he comes out and helps us. He's the Malcolm Stevenson Forbes Class of 1941 Professor of History and Public Affairs at the Wilson School, because we like short titles. His research focus is on American political history. Mr. Scott is the author of 5 best-selling biographies, and he won the Pulitzer Prize for his biography of Charles Lindbergh. He is from the great class of 1971, and he's also a charter trustee at Princeton University. So welcome. We will have a book sale and signing and a lovely reception afterwards in Schultz Dining Room, so thank you very much.
Thanks for coming. It's wonderful to have one of the great biographers here with us, and obviously even better, speaking about a figure who looms large for this university and in particular this school. And I thought I'd just start off by asking the basic question of how you ended up turning your attention to Woodrow Wilson and deciding that he should be the subject of your book.
Right. I think I'll start with where I started before I end up, which is when I was 15, I read a book about Woodrow Wilson that really entranced me. And I've been carrying Woodrow Wilson around with me since I was 15. I'm a little embarrassed to say that at 15 I put Woodrow Wilson's picture up on my wall. Now, I don't want you to think I was some strange, nerdy guy who had Woodrow Wilson's picture, because I had other pictures up there. I had F. Scott Fitzgerald, and I had Adlai Stevenson, and I had Don Quixote. So they were all up there. I think I was the only kid in my high school who did. But I've had this long, long interest. Came to Princeton in part because of Woodrow Wilson. And it was here that I began writing, actually. My first book was an outgrowth of my senior thesis for the Department of English, which was a thesis on Maxwell Perkins, who was the one and only great book editor in the history of American literature, I think. This was a man who literally discovered and developed F. Scott Fitzgerald, class of 17, Ernest Hemingway, Thomas Wolfe, Ring Lardner, John Marquand, James Jones, Alan Paton. I could give you 40 of the most important writers in this country between the 2 world wars whom Max Perkins discovered and developed. I will get to Woodrow Wilson in a moment. When I graduated from Princeton in 1971, the English department passed back my thesis and said, this technically isn't a thesis, it's really the first draft of a book. And so we hope you will turn this thesis into a book. What the Princeton English department didn't tell me is it would take another 7 years to do that. But it is a powerful instinct not to want to go to law school. And so that's what I did for the next 7 years. I wrote that book. Now, 2 years into that book, I'm getting to Woodrow Wilson, I swear, but 2 years into that book, I began to think, wouldn't it be interesting to write not just a biography, but perhaps to write a shelf full of biographies of 20th century American cultural figures. So at the end of the day, at the end of a career, you would have my take on 20th century America through the lives of perhaps a half dozen great Americans. Then I began to think, wouldn't it be interesting to have each of my subjects from a different part of the country and each from a different wedge of the great apple pie that we call American culture. And so after Max Perkins, who was a 9th generation white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, Harvard-educated, so to speak, book editor, I turned to the West Coast. I wrote about a man named Shmuel Gelbfish, who was a semi-literate teenage runaway from Poland, a Jew who went to the West Coast, changed his name to Samuel Goldwyn, and he started something that we now popularly call Hollywood. After writing about Goldwyn, I turned to the Midwest. I was looking for metaphors of the 20th century, and I began to think of the airplane. Who is the great romantic embodiment of the airplane? Lindbergh, of course. And so all roads kept pointing, to St. Louis and its spirit. And so my third book was about Charles Lindbergh. Parenthetically, I did a book on Katharine Hepburn, who was a longtime friend of mine, and I wrote a memoir that I squeezed in there about her. Then, to answer your question, I began to think I haven't written about a Southern figure. Most people don't realize it, but Woodrow Wilson was from the South. Born in Stanton, Virginia in 1856, raised in Georgia and the two Carolinas. I had not written about a political figure. I had not written about a governmental figure. I had not written about a figure from higher education. And all those things kept pointing to Woodrow Wilson. And so I mentioned this to my book editor, who thought this would be a great idea. And so that's how I came to write a book about Woodrow Wilson. The other answers will be short.
No, that's terrific. And then the kind of two issues which come out in the book that were interesting early on are religion and race, both important factors of American life in that period. Religion is something not as commonly discussed with Wilson. Can you talk about both of those elements of him, both as a person and as president?
Yes, because I think they're both extremely important to Woodrow Wilson. I would say this about religion and Wilson. I believe Woodrow Wilson was the most religious president we ever had. I am not forgetting Jimmy Carter here, and a number of others, especially in the early days. This is a man, Woodrow Wilson, who was the son of a Presbyterian minister. He was the grandson of a Presbyterian minister. If you shake the family trees of the Woodrows and the Wilsons, another dozen Presbyterian ministers will fall from the branches. They will just litter the ground. This is a man who got on his knees and prayed twice a day, said grace before every meal, read the Bible every night. I know we've had a lot of religious presidents. Usually they're religious once every 4 years. Woodrow Wilson was religious every moment of his life. Personally, that began to affect his professional life, as it would. They are inextricably wound. And so the religion, that is Wilson's morality, really comes into great play because increasingly I began to see, as I think readers and students of Wilson see, that his own personal morality was beginning to dictate foreign policy, which would indeed affect not just 20th century America, but now the 21st century world even. So that's Woodrow Wilson and religion in a nutshell. Race is an extremely important and complicated aspect of Wilson's life and his presidential career. Wilson was, as I said, a Southerner. He was the first president elected from the South since the Civil War. He was elected in 1912. That is, of course, now some 50 years after the Civil War. The election of Woodrow Wilson to the presidency was seen as a great reunion for the country. The two pieces that had really been split apart geographically, ideologically, were really going to come together because of Wilson's election, many believed. The South was really going to be brought back into the country, and we were going to become the reunited States of America. Now, Wilson, as I said, was born in Virginia and raised in the South. He is the only president, I should throw in, we've ever had who grew up in a country that lost a war, namely the Confederate States of America. He is somebody who, needless to say, grew up in a very 19th, if not 18th or 17th century world in which there was definitely a social division between blacks and whites in this country. His father, as I said, was a minister. His father preached on the, well, I wouldn't say the virtues of slavery, but the rightness of slavery, that indeed there's slavery talked about in the Bible, that there was nothing immoral about slavery, that was just a fact of life. Woodrow Wilson grew up with this. And again, he grew up seeing social divisions in this country. Now, Wilson himself, when you scratched him, if you went below the epidermis, because I'm about to discuss some racism that he definitely had. But I don't think this was, if there are degrees of racism, I don't think this was a man who had hatred. He did not have contempt for African Americans. But, and now let's get into the story. When Woodrow Wilson became president in 1913, one of the first things that was presented to him by his Secretary of the Treasury and by his Postmaster General, two of the great employers of African Americans in Washington. They were both Southern racists. I should add they were both virulent Southern racists. I should add that most of Wilson's cabinet was made up of Southern racists. I should also remind you, Woodrow Wilson appointed every one of them. Now that bespeaks another point, that racism was not that important a matter at this particular moment. It certainly was if you were an African American, but to the majority of this country, if you go through the platforms of 1912, it was not in the Democratic platform, the Republican platform, it was not in the Bull Moose Progressive platform, it was not even in the Socialist platform. The black issue was not being discussed. Now, these two departments, Treasury and the Post Office, their heads came to Wilson and said, there have been motions toward integration in Washington in those offices. And they said, this is simply not acceptable. There are situations in which blacks and whites will have to work together. They will have to share lunchrooms. They will have to share washrooms. And they said, this is just going to create a great deal of friction and something worse than that in Washington. And they urged Wilson to allow the segregation of those two departments. They also pointed out that the law of the land in 1913 was not a very old decision on the books. It was Plessy versus Ferguson from 1896, which basically called for separate but equal. And so that was it. And Wilson went along with it. Needless to say, segregating two divisions of the federal government in Washington essentially sanctioned segregation everywhere in the country. And that is what happened. Wilson, I believe, thought he was doing the best thing, was doing the right thing, not just for white America, but even for black America. He said many times, there is one part of this country, no, of the world, that nobody needs to explain anything to me about, and that is the South. And no matter what Wilson's views were on race, and I think they were evolving, but no matter what they were, he knew his Southern brethren was not ready for integration. And so he went along with this policy. In a matter of months, even the Booker T. Washington blacks were coming to Wilson saying, this is really bad. You've really set us back. And Wilson said, no, this is really for your protection, and we have separate but equal. And finally, people were doing surveys and looking at the various offices and cafeterias and so forth in Washington. and they came to him and they said they are separate, but they are not equal. And Wilson basically said and did nothing. So I think Wilson's greatest sin in this matter was acts of, I think there were several acts of omission more than the commission of the segregation. I will add one other thing here, and this is where I think Wilson's Southern-born racism really began to bubble to the surface. And that was after World War I. Tens of thousands of African Americans fought in the First World War. And when they came back from the war, they really felt this was going to be their moment. They felt we had shed blood, we had lost lives, just like our white brothers did. And surely this will be a moment where we can be integrated into American society. And when they did return, Woodrow Wilson said and did nothing, absolutely nothing for the African American. And for me, anyway, as a student of his life, this to me, I think, was the most racist thing he ever did. Because he, who was the most educated president we ever had, really could have used this as a great teaching moment. He, the professor-in-chief of the United States, could have said to the country, you know what, these black soldiers have given their blood, have given their lives, and we must now start integrating. But that the president said and did nothing, I think in essence allowed the rest of the country to say and do nothing, and that was the case. So I've got a lot in the book on Wilson and race. I think it's the most compelling professional story in his life, but there you have the crystallization of it.
You talk, recently there's this, renewed interest in Wilson among conservatives who have kind of been looking back to him as the source of evil or a moment in American history where things went wrong. And I think liberal or moderate historians, whatever, who look back at him are often surprised how much happens on the domestic front. Federal Reserve is created, the FTC, the progressive income tax, all this happens in his first few years. Can you give us a sense what he was trying to do, how you characterize his objectives with all of that? Because he often is thought of as a relatively conservative president, but if you look at the record, he's not.
If you look at the record, I think you will see the greatest progressive agenda that the country had seen to date. I mean, this was a genuine progressive who not only came in with an agenda, he got that agenda enacted. And this was extremely important to him. And I think a lot of this progressivism, at least the seeds of it, go back to Princeton. They go back not only to his time as a president here or as a professor here, but indeed his days as a student here, where he was basically a poor minister's son who was surrounded by great wealth. And wealth, old wealth in this country, a lot of great new wealth, but he saw people, especially from New York, who represented these vast fortunes. And Wilson never begrudged people their wealth, but what he was against was unfair advantage. And the through line I see in Wilson's life as the president of Princeton and as governor of New Jersey, which he was ever so briefly, and as president of the United States, there is one theme that runs through all of it, and it is that of leveling the playing field. And just the things you mentioned there, the modern income tax with its graduated rates, the Federal Reserve System, even putting Louis Brandeis, the first Jew on the Supreme Court, basically shattering one of the first, well, maybe the first great glass ceiling at the national level. Almost every progressive measure you will see, what it has at its foundation is a leveling of the playing field. So that's what he set out to do. Now, not only did he come up with these thoughts and bring about, he also had a way of making them happen. And this, too, I think, is rather compelling. Wilson believed, well, I've spoken about this a lot in the last 6 months since the book came out, and it's always rather fascinating to some people, because Wilson had a really interesting take on how this government should work. He had this very peculiar idea, he being a student of political science, that two branches of the government, the executive branch, that is the White House, and the legislative branch, the Senate and the Congress. Get ready for this. It's a big concept. He believed that those two branches should cooperate. And I mean that quite literally. He believed they should cooperate the government. And so Wilson, when he came into the White House, one of the first things he did was leave the White House and go down to the Congress. You know, we have a big ceremony once a year where the president goes down Pennsylvania Avenue, or up Pennsylvania Avenue, and delivers the State of the Union speech. No president had set foot in the Congress to do business for over 112 years until Woodrow Wilson decided he was going to show up quite regularly, deliver the State of the Union address in person. Whenever Wilson had an important legislative measure he wanted to introduce, he would call a joint session of Congress. Now, if a president today calls 2 or 3 joint sessions of Congress in 8 years, that's a lot. Wilson called 25 joint sessions of Congress. This is almost every other month. He just calls them all together, comes down to Congress, gives a speech on what he wants and why he wants it, and then he'd go home. But here's what he did that was even more shocking. He would come back the next day, and he'd come back the day after that, and the day after that. And he conducted business on a day-to-day basis with the legislature. And he did it by showing up in a little room that sits right in the middle of the Capitol. It is a room that, well, it's a room that no president had used before him, and almost no president has used after him. And he would just sit there and conduct business. Now, I think one of the reasons presidents haven't used the room is it has a very tricky name. It's called the President's Room. It is the most beautiful little room in the entire Capitol, and it is put aside simply for the President of the United States to conduct business with the Congress, to cooperate the government. And that's what Wilson did regularly.
Sounds like Kevin Spacey's character in the new season of House of Cards, without the murders.
Yeah.
Sorry to right.
Oh, thank you. Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. And kind of, what did the Republicans think of him, though? So he was also a partisan in certain.
He was a partisan. He was a big Democrat, make no mistake about it. But what he did was he engaged in conversation. He had a dialogue with the country through the medium of the Congress. So while they often disagreed with him, and they often really despised him, they nonetheless respected him. They always did that. And he, it's amazing. People thought, what does a college professor know? Well, in this case, he knew a lot, and he really understood how to work people. He was very, very political. And so the Congress always knew they could have an intelligent conversation with Wilson. But what happened was, because he was essentially the smartest guy in the city of Washington, Wilson would basically go down there and hold preceptorials in the Congress. And he would teach these guys a thing or two. So increasingly, the enmity between the Republicans and Woodrow Wilson grew. And in fact, his Congresses got, and this is an oxymoron, got progressively conservative, but they did. And nonetheless, Wilson kept fighting the fight, and for the most part, the Congress at least continued to listen to him.
On the eve of America's entrance into the war, what was he thinking? I mean, from your study of him, how did he envision what the war was about, what the United States would do? What were his fears, his ambitions?
Yes. Well, the war broke out, of course, in 1914. And one of the things I tried to show in the book, too, this is just a parenthesis, but it's something I hope readers or just students will consider, because it's largely what my book is about, is the very week that World War I broke out in Europe. Woodrow Wilson's most beloved wife, a beautiful woman he had met in the South and married and had been the president of Princeton's wife, Ellen Axon Wilson, died in the White House. This was crushing. It was deeply depressing. Wilson considered giving up the presidency. He could barely get out of bed. It was only this great sense of duty that did get him out of bed, that and that this war had just broken out. Wilson's basic feeling at the beginning of the war was that it didn't have to become a war. And he thought the personalities were overpowering the principles. He thought that there was a lot of posturing and saber rattling going on, which there was. And so for the first year, second year, now into the third year, he really did everything he could to keep us out of that war. That became, of course, his campaign slogan in 1916. He kept us out of war. He saw, however, that there was this general movement, this feeling that we were going to get into it. He insisted that Americans remain neutral about the war. He said we must remain not just politically neutral, he said we must remain neutral in thought. I mean, this is a big thing. Wilson himself said that because he did that for himself. He was very pro-British all his life. He was a great student of the parliamentary system. He, in fact, really preferred the British governmental system to the American. He really always had some great fears, if not contempt, about Germany and what they were doing. So that was long an issue. But increasingly, the Germans were torpedoing even neutral ships. American lives were being lost, most famously on the Lusitania. But there were another dozen neutral ships that went down. There were hundreds of American lives being lost. We had saber rattlers in this country, the Teddy Roosevelts, accusing Wilson of being a weak sister, of being a wimp in essence, and saying, what are we doing? Why aren't we fighting this war? You know, he was ready to go up San Juan Hill again. He even went to Wilson ultimately and asked if he could muster his Rough Riders again and charge, you know, I mean, bully. So there was that whole rising movement in this country. Wilson believed in severe diplomacy. He was sending notes, memoranda back and forth to Germany. Germany was really just kind of messing with Wilson. Wilson would complain in a note, they would write back, no, that's not true. Wilson would write back, okay, then they'd say, you're right, we'll investigate, we'll punish. And then, of course, 2 months later, there'd be another torpedoing, there'd be more American lives lost, and that would be that. Until, finally, 1917 is arriving. Wilson realizes, well, first of all, he's now reelected in 1916. He takes office again in March of 1917. And Wilson realizes that the German belligerence is only getting worse, that America now has no other way to respond but to go to war. We uncover the Zimmerman note, which suggests that Germany had gone to Mexico, encouraging them to come into the war on the German side, and if you do, you will have spoils of war. We will give you California and Texas back. You know, it'll be great. You can reunite Mexico. So this was kind of exciting for the Mexicans. And it was at this point, really, that Wilson realized, okay, we must do something. Now, coupled with this, and you asked early on about Wilson's religion, and here's where things come into play, because this is perhaps the greatest moment of a president's personal morality really taking over his professional, his presidential policy. And Wilson delivered a speech on April 2nd, 1917, which every student, indeed every American should know, because I believe it is the most important foreign policy speech ever given in this country. The essence of that speech, there is one sentence in which Woodrow Wilson said, "The world must be made safe for democracy." Now, whether you like that or not, whether you agree with that or not, that has been the foundation of American foreign policy since 1917. Whether it's Haiti, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's Iraq, whether it's maybe Syria next month, who knows, all that goes back to Woodrow Wilson. Now, who said the world must be made safe for democracy? Where is that written? Well, it's written in Woodrow Wilson's head. It's written in his heart. He believed that the mighty nations had a certain responsibility to look after the less mighty. And so he believed we could not just sit back and watch Germanys of the world walk all over the Belgiums of the world, and that it behooved great powers, such as the United States, which was now just becoming a great power, that it behooved this country to go to war and become a great protector. And the reason I think Wilson allowed us, urged us, encouraged us to get into that war was that he believed if we entered and won the war, then indeed we could dictate the peace. And Wilson famously had 14 ideas for the peace. He called them points. The 14th point was a League of Nations. Basically, a table at which all the countries of the world could sit and discuss matters before they went to war. In fact, they would have to submit to discussion before they went to war. And if indeed they did, they would fight not just one country, but they would come up against the collective security of all the other nations within the League. And just to bring this full circle, Wilson always believed that had there been a League of Nations in place in 1914, after that assassination in Sarajevo, if indeed the heads of all the European countries especially had come to the table to talk it through, instead of worrying about who was Grandma, Queen Victoria's favorite, we wouldn't have gone to that war. Nobody would have. That was an unnecessary war that just blew up.
I want to open the floor to questions, so I'll ask my final question. If you have questions, you can line up by the speakers. Maybe that's the best way. He does sound, I mean, he comes through the book as someone who believes in organization, which is not conventionally what you think of as Wilson, but in terms of running Congress, in terms of the League of Nations, it's a...
Wilson, as a student, as a doctoral student, and I remind you, if you don't know, he is the only president we've ever had with a PhD to this day. He was a student of administration. He knew how things worked. He applied that when he was president of Princeton. This was the man who basically created the model for higher education, not just on this campus, but indeed in the country. He was the one who really began to categorize things here. He was the one who began seriously to divide this college into majors, into departments. And within each department, he thought there should be a sequence of courses. He thought there should be what we now call distribution requirements, so that every student would study in different areas, that you would have 2 lectures a week and a small class with a group of young professors he imported to this campus that he called preceptors, so that you'd have 2 classes or 2 lectures and a class each week. All these things, you see, these divisions, this organization, that was Wilsonian, started at Princeton. And he carried those principles, you see, wherever he went, and became a very effective wartime president. He was a great commander-in-chief, largely because he created all these divisions. The extreme right wing, or not even the extreme right wing, the right wing despises him so much in part because the federal government just ballooned during World War I and became just this either administrative nightmare or this great administrative model.
Wow, precepts to the League of Nations.
There you go. They are one and the same.
Okay, you can ask.
Well, thank you, first of all, for this wonderful, wonderful book. I read it with so much interest, and it was such an eye-opener.
Thank you.
You just see all of the great issues of the 20th century lining up at the door, waiting to be played out with
You do.
all of the tremendous problems that we had. I had just a small historical question on the racism issue, which unfortunately clouds too much of the discussion. My first and actually my last job in Washington, D.C. in the mid-1960s, rather briefly, was in the old Health Education Welfare Building. And I was kind of realized after a while there that there was a very large number of bathrooms in the building. And I eventually came to realize that it had been from segregation days. When was the Washington bureaucracy actually desegregated?
Well, Wilson
Wilson didn't, we know.
No, he certainly didn't. But listen, there are plenty of people alive today who remember segregated Washington, D.C. up until the 60s even. Brown versus Board of Ed wasn't until the mid-50s. So, it was alive and well there. And I would just say, and again, I'm not Woodrow Wilson. I don't support segregation. But I would like to explain that Wilson said many a time he believed the country should integrate, but he just said this country is not ready in 1913. He said it will take another generation or 2 before it can segregate, or integrate rather. And he said that, I think, because he knew the South, and he knew there were, in Wilson's day, there were still Southerners who had fought at Gettysburg. In fact, the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, there was a giant reunion on the battlefield where these soldiers, famously shook hands across a stone wall. So Washington didn't completely segregate until the 60s. And that's why, yes, indeed, there are all those bathrooms, and there were separate lunchrooms, and it was, it was something that Wilson, I think he really didn't want. I think he figured whenever the country did integrate, all hell was going to break loose. And he didn't want that on his watch, and he just felt, I think he couldn't do that to his fellow Southerners, and I think he felt in many ways he couldn't do it to the Northerners, too. Segregation, or at least segregationist attitudes, were not limited just to the South. It was prevalent throughout this country. And Wilson was very mindful of that. I wanted to add one other thing on the comment I made about the soldiers coming home, the black soldiers in 1919. When Wilson said and did nothing welcoming them home, I think that has no small part in the fact that the summer of 1919 became the summer of the worst race riots in the country. It's known as the Red Summer because of all the blood that was shed. So, it was going to be a bad time whenever it was. And 1919, the Red Summer, gave us, I think, the first indication of what was going to happen.
Thank you.
One of the things, Scott, that I learned, that was rendered vivid, I really learned from the book, was Wilson, the romancer.
Yes.
And what I'm actually, the other thing I learned about was what an effective, in fact, prophetic public speaker he was. That's something that isn't necessarily vivid from the work of your predecessors. what would it be like to listen to a Wilson speech? It's obviously wouldn't have been, listening to Woodrow Wilson speak wouldn't have been like listening to a pedant. Wouldn't have been a merely sort of abstract and high-minded professor. What would have been like, what would it have sounded like? What would he have sounded like to?
Wilson was, I believe, the greatest orator of the day. I should also tell you, Woodrow Wilson is the last president of the United States to write all of his own speeches. And when I say when he wrote them all, most of his speeches he delivered off the cuff. Certainly his campaign speeches were all delivered that way. When he toured the country in 1919, trying to sell the nation on the League of Nations, he was giving sometimes 5 speeches a day. And he would go out there with a note card with 5 bullet points. He would talk for an hour or an hour and a half. I've gone through, someone would transcribe everything he said. I've gone through these speeches. There is not a grammatical error. There is not a word out of place. There is not a paragraph that does not logically follow its predecessor. He was just dazzling in terms of content. He had a beautiful lyric tenor voice. He articulated magnificently. He was also a new kind of orator. We have samples of him speaking. We don't have film of him speaking. You can see film of him giving speeches, but you can't hear him because sound had not been attached to film until 1926, 1927. But if you look even at the silent movies of Teddy Roosevelt, William Jennings Bryan, and Woodrow Wilson, for example, who were the 3 perhaps greatest orators of that moment, you will see fists to heaven and all this, never with Woodrow Wilson. He was the first modern speaker we had in politics. And here, I think, is one of his secrets. The other one is this, and I think this is perhaps the greatest thing about Wilson as an orator. He never dumbed down his speeches. He was a college professor, and used the same vocabulary if he was talking to an academic audience as he would talking to some truck drivers. And this, I think, had a rather tonic, if not magical, effect on the public because he never spoke down to people. He lifted them up. And in fact, he would get the greatest responses from the poor and the uneducated because they understood him. And here was a guy who didn't treat them differently, and it elevated them. And they walked out feeling better about themselves and thus feeling better about Woodrow Wilson.
And he could also be quite a romantic in his letter writing.
He was a pure romantic. As you will see in the book, if you haven't already, this is a man who, when he courted his first wife, wrote thousands of love letters. I mean, these are the most passionate love letters. I've read letters of the Adamses, of the Brownings. I've read Henry Miller's letters. Woodrow Wilson's are the most romantic I've ever seen. I mean, some of them go on for pages and pages, especially when he is courting Ellen Axon. It reached a point where these letters just got sickening after a while. How many ways can you say I love you? But Wilson would do it over and over again in these pages. He would do it. He would fall in love with his own poetry. And fortunately, so did Ellen Axon Wilson. And indeed, then he courts a second woman, Edith Bowling Galt, who becomes in many ways the first female president of the United States when Wilson has a stroke in the White House, which is kept secret from the world, and Mrs. Wilson is running the show. But during their courtship, Wilson again engaged in this correspondence, hundreds of passionate letters to Edith. They're quite something. And you look at prim and proper Woodrow Wilson. I'm telling you, the guy was an animal. He really was. In fact, I was very happy. I did a talk in Washington that Maureen Dowd came to, and somebody asked this question. We were talking about this, and 2 days later, she had an article on Woodrow Wilson in the New York Times, and the headline was, "Woodrow Wilson, Stud Muffin." And I thought, you got it. You got it. That's exactly right.
Well, just to, on that point, we have a Woodrow Wilson Facebook page, and Dan Link gave us one of his love letters, and that's what we posted for Valentine's Day, and it had 5,000 views, so we usually get like 200 views of everything, so. But my question is sort of twofold. One is if you could talk a little bit about his role and how he played during the women's suffrage movement.
Yes.
And then a point that you just touched on is the role of Edith and what happened when he had a stroke and how much power she really did yield.
Right. Wilson has received, to some measure, a bum rap when it comes to the suffrage movement. A lot of people have suggested that he was against women's suffrage. He really wasn't. He did think it should have been a state issue, a state's right, and he was a little slow. He was definitely slow in coming around to it, coming to a constitutional amendment for women having the right to vote everywhere. In fact, shortly after he got elected president in 1915, as I recall, he got on the train and came up to Princeton here where he voted, and because suffrage was on the state ballot. So he was always for it. Here's the thing also I wanted to add, and you will notice, and again, I'm not apologizing for this man, but I want you to understand context. And it's all too easy, whether you're talking about race or women's rights or whatever, to cover things with presentism, to take our views in 2014 and say, well, of course that should have been the way it was in 1914, but the world simply wasn't there. And here was the most interesting thing I found out while I was researching the women's movement, especially at that time. And it's a little like the gay rights movement today, that it really wasn't about gender or sexuality so much as it was about generations. And it's quite interesting to me that when the women's suffrage question came up in the teens in this country, when Wilson was president, Mrs. Woodrow Wilson was against women's suffrage. Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt was against women's suffrage. But if you asked any of their children, it was, what are you talking about? Of course we should have the vote. It was just that moment where another generation was not only embracing it, but urging it, and sort of saying, how can you even be discussing this? So that's where he begins. Now, Wilson always had the door open to all the petitioners. Famously, Alice Paul and the left wing of the women's movement, in that day, they were chaining themselves to the White House fence and carrying banners, likening Wilson to the Kaiser and all that. And Wilson said, look, anytime you want to come in and talk about it, you can. But no, actually Alice Paul didn't want to come in and talk about it. She, and properly so perhaps, was looking for celebrity. She was looking for publicity, and she got it. She was carted off to jail. Wilson immediately said, let her out of jail. Alice Paul said, I don't want to leave. They said, okay, Alice Paul, here's your meal today. Alice Paul said, I'm not eating. And so, as was policy, not Wilson's policy, but the policy of the District of Columbia, if you didn't eat after a certain while, you were force-fed. That's the way they treated people in asylums. It's the way they treated people in prisons. And so they famously force-fed Alice Paul. She could have walked out anytime she wanted, but it was indeed, she felt, better for her cause to be force-fed and have that published in the newspapers. Now, here's where Wilson has his great come-to-Jesus moment on the question of women's suffrage. And that was once we entered the war. In 1917, Wilson now realized several things. Society changed greatly. Millions of men went off to war. Women, more and more, were leaving the house, were working outside the house. The roles of women were redefined. Wilson believed two things. The first was that women were really running households in new ways now, and that this was a great contribution to the war effort, basically. The second thing he believed was, how could we be fighting for freedom over in Europe when indeed women did not have all the freedoms that men did? And so almost overnight, Woodrow Wilson converted and became a great activist and began lobbying hard in the Congress, and went to the extent that he went to his opponents in the Congress on this matter and said, this is a war measure. Now that was highest priority. Anything that was a war measure was pretty hard to turn down. Many of them still resisted, but the women's suffrage movement, the 19th Amendment, squeaked by and was embraced shortly thereafter. So that's sort of where he was on suffrage. Again, he was never opposed to it. He was slow to it. And finally, with the war, he fully embraced a constitutional measure. Part two was, Mrs. Wilson. Right, the second Mrs. Wilson. So, Wilson remarries. He met this rather attractive young widow who worked and lived in Washington. Her first husband had died and left her a jewelry store that was operating in Washington by the family, really, until just 10 or 15 years ago, called Galt's Jewelers, downtown Washington. Wilson met her, immediately fell in love with her. His doctor, a physician named Dr. Cary Grayson, who has a very important role in American history, actually, as it turns out, knew this woman and set up a cute meet that you see in 1930s movies. And these two people met. Wilson fell madly in love with her, wanted to marry her. She did not want to get married. She was a rather shy woman, certainly didn't want to marry the President of the United States. He courted her rather privately in the White House, sent her all these letters, and finally won her over. They got married after knowing each other but a year, and then she goes to Paris with him for the 6 months that they drafted the peace agreement. She went with him. They were the closest married couple in the history of the White House. And I'm not forgetting the Adamses, and I'm not forgetting the Reagans. These people were virtually inseparable. There were days where Wilson, especially during the war, would visit the various departments of government around Washington. Mrs. Wilson would go with him. She would sit in on the meetings. Wilson had her decoding messages at night. So he was really almost training her to become a presidential assistant. Irony of ironies, Wilson goes out on this 29-city tour to try to convince America to adopt the League of Nations, to adopt the peace treaty that the Republican Senate does not want to adopt. He collapses in the middle of it. He is rushed by train back to the White House. 3 days later, he suffers a stroke. And this is the stroke they keep from the world. And so I think this is the greatest conspiracy in American history, because Mrs. Wilson and 2 or 3 doctors decided on their own to tell nobody for a year and a half that the President of the United States had suffered a stroke. And during this period, basically, Mrs. Wilson takes charge of the White House. And for a year and a half, nobody saw the President of the United States. No document, nothing that required a signature. No waiting dignitary could get to see Woodrow Wilson without passing first through Mrs. Wilson, who decided who and what appeared before her husband. And so you could argue she was either a glorified chief of staff, you could argue, as she did, that she was merely a steward, just sort of functioning as a secretary, or as you will see in the book, because I try to lay it out day by day what she did and didn't do, but it's an easy argument that Edith Bowling Galt Wilson, remember her name, became the first female president of the United States.
This is a big question without an answer, but it seems like you're very well situated to take a stab at it. What would you say has more power and influence on American life, Washington or Hollywood?
Oh my gosh. What has more influence on Washington? Oh my gosh. Well, I like to think Washington, and yet, I don't know. I think there's an increase in Hollywood's power. I will sidestep your question to point this out, though, that the first moment that Washington and Hollywood married was during Woodrow Wilson's presidency. Wilson was the first president, well, because Hollywood had just begun, actually. The first feature film ever made in Hollywood was in 1914. And it was at this moment that Hollywood stars, for the first time, began to appear. And once we entered the war in 1917, Wilson and his Secretary of the Treasury had these bond sales, Liberty bonds, and Wilson and the Secretary of the Treasury, William Gibbs McAdoo, who became his son-in-law, had this great idea. Why don't we recruit Hollywood stars to come to these rallies? And it was the first time, basically, that Hollywood was used. And it was the beginning of this relationship between them. And then, of course, you've got, and this is something that I also go into in the book, you have The Birth of a Nation, which is a notoriously racist movie, which Wilson ran in the White House. He is the first president ever to run a film in the White House. It was controversial when he did it in the White House. It was controversial when it played everywhere in the country. I'm sorry to say, in a way, because I love the line, the most famous movie review ever written and attributed to Woodrow Wilson, it is like writing history with lightning, he never said. But the sentiment is certainly Wilson's. So, I don't know. It's a nice question. It's worth pondering. I'd say at the moment, I'm going to give the nod to Washington because Hollywood movies have really become, especially in the last decade or two, nothing but comic books for the most part. So I think the day actually somebody comes from another planet or an asteroid is about to destroy the Earth, I think then Hollywood will become more important. But for the moment, I like to think guys in Washington are looking after stuff.
Scott, just two quick questions. One, you mentioned earlier about him being a Southern president. He actually came from New Jersey. And I'm just wondering, did coming from New Jersey make him more palatable for other parts of the country that would have been reluctant to vote for someone from the old Confederacy? That's one. And then two is, how do you cram all this in one volume?
How do I do what?
How did you cram all this life
Oh, I
into
see,
one
yeah,
volume?
very small type. It's a very good question, actually. I mean, people knew Wilson was from the South, although indeed he spent most of his life in New Jersey. He spent most of his life in Princeton, New Jersey, to be specific. He did not speak with an accent, although, you know, don't forget, campaigning in 1912, people didn't hear voices. We didn't have radio. He wasn't on television. You couldn't go see the newsreels even and hear Woodrow Wilson. So very few, relatively few people actually heard Woodrow Wilson. They would read Wilson unless you went to one of these campaign stops. But certainly his New Jersey-ness helped. He was, as a historian, he was considered the first, or at least the foremost, historian to write about the Civil War even-handedly. Because he grew up in the South but had spent the bulk of his life and career in the North, he really did treat both sides equally. And I think that, you know, the more educated voters certainly knew that. So that was certainly a factor. And being a good politician, Wilson was from whatever state he was campaigning in. But he had a lot of them. I mean, he lived in Virginia, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Then he went to Maryland, where he got his PhD at Hopkins. He taught at Bryn Mawr, he taught at Wesleyan in Connecticut, and then he came down to Princeton. So he could, he was from everywhere. So that was pretty good. Part two was what? Oh, how did I get it? Well, yeah, exactly. It did involve a lot of crystallizing. My primary interest was writing a very personal book about Woodrow Wilson. I felt there had been so much written about Wilson, about his policies, about a lot of political histories, diplomatic histories, military histories. Oh, that's great, and I love all that. I felt, however, that nobody had ever written a humanizing biography of Wilson. What was it like to be Woodrow Wilson and wake up every day? What was it carrying around that spirituality, carrying around those romantic ideas and ideals, as he always talked about? So that became my primary story, keeping the personal life of Woodrow Wilson moving along. Now, how does that impact on all the great events, and how do all the great events impact upon that? And so I tried to, I just try to shrink stories down as much as I could, but keeping the reader educated enough to understand the great issues that were being discussed in Wilson's day. It's why, frankly, it's why the book took 13 years to write. Most of the book, I wrote the book in a year. The rest of it was research and rewriting and condensing. I carry in my head, and I say this for fellow writers out there and whether it's a dissertation or a book or a thesis. I remember in the 70s, Alistair Cook did a great television series and a book on America called America. It was a 13-week series, as I recall. And I remember he was later being interviewed about it, and he was talking about how one of the challenges for him is he had to write this thing to fit an hour a week. And he had to do the Civil War in 1 hour. And in fact, he had to discuss all the fighting of the Civil War in 2 sentences. And I thought, okay, if he can reduce the fighting of the Civil War to 2 sentences, I can reduce anything to 2 sentences too. And so there's just a lot of reduction all the time. I had a great friend who was the daughter of Louis B. Mayer and the wife of David Selznick and the producer of Streetcar Named Desire. Her name was Irene Selznick. And she was a great help to me when I was writing my Goldwyn book. And I remember we were talking about a big chunk I had in my book on Goldwyn while I was still writing it. And we were eating in her apartment that night, and we were eating some lobster bisque. And she said, "Dear, what makes this lobster bisque taste so good, do you think?" And I said, "I don't know, what is it?" And she said, "Reduction." They just keep cooking it until you just get down to the essence of the flavor. And indeed, that's what I try to do with each of my stories in the book. And indeed, as a biographer, I have the same task that the novelist has, that the writer of a limerick has, and that's to tell a story. And so, a story can be told in a sentence or it can be told in 1,000 pages. So, does that answer anything?
Perhaps each of you can ask a question. That'll be the final ones for our books.
Hi. Can you comment on the Sedition Act and the censorship by the Postmaster General under Wilson?
Yes, this is even more than race, perhaps the lowest low point of the Wilson administration. So I will not excuse it, but I will try to explain it, which is during World War I, Woodrow Wilson reenacted the Alien and Sedition Acts that began with John Adams, that indeed Wilson, as he often said, Lincoln reintroduced. Wilson's feeling on all this, and there was much suppression once we were in the war, especially. And Wilson's feeling was, once he had sent soldiers overseas, he felt he owed it to those men who were giving their lives that he, as president, and the nation was doing everything possible to support them. And that meant anybody who spoke out against the country, or more specifically, spoke out against basically armed forces and what was happening overseas, that was destructive to morale, above all. The most famous example of what happened during this period, of course, was Eugene Debs, the great socialist, who did give a speech. As he was giving the speech, he said, "I know there are people listening determining whether this is seditious or not." And what Debs said in one speech in particular was, he was talking to working men, and he said, "You don't have to go to this war. You don't have to be a capitalist tool. That this war is largely about capitalism, and you don't have to be cannon fodder for it." Indeed, Debs was arrested. He was sent to prison. He was found, ultimately it was ruled on by the Supreme Court, who unanimously came down and said he was guilty of violating the sedition acts. So Wilson Wilson strongly went along with all of this. He really believed in it. And here's the downside of Wilson, really. Here's a worse part of the story, let me put it that way. The war is now over. The Attorney General, Palmer, who was famous for the notorious Palmer raids, A. Mitchell Palmer, he comes to Wilson. He says, "Mr. President, the war is over. Eugene Debs is an old man now. His health is not good. He's still in prison. He's really not a threat to this country. And I have drawn up the pardon. All it needs is your signature, sir." And Wilson took out his pen and wrote, "Denied." You don't cross Woodrow Wilson. And he believed, there was one other thing I want to say that sets this up. Almost every biography will tell you, I talked about that speech, "The world must be made safe for democracy." And every book on Woodrow Wilson gives you the scene where Wilson gives the speech, huge applause, they voted, we will go to war and all that. I don't know of another biography that gives you the scene after that. And here's the scene. It's in the book. The speech is over. Woodrow and Edith Wilson get in the car. They drive down home to the White House. Wilson goes into his office. He puts his head down on the table and he sobs. He said, and somebody comes in, one of his assistants said, "Is everything all right?" And he said, "Did you hear them applaud that speech? I've just sent 1 million or 2 men to their deaths, and they're applauding that?" Wilson took the deaths of every one of his soldiers. He took the lives seriously, but he took the deaths even more seriously. And so this is just something he believed in. So that was the core of those sedition acts. But he had, when it came time to show some clemency, he just didn't have it in his heart. That's just who he was.
Final question.
So I was surprised you didn't say more about Hollywood, and since I gather Leonardo DiCaprio has bought the movie rights to this book.
Correct.
But I'm more interested in the question of how, I'm persuaded very much that Wilson is this romantic, but in your book, you basically deny the claim that's often been made that he had this affair with Mrs. Peck.
Yes, the notorious
Curious about
Mrs.
how you...
Peck. Okay. When Woodrow Wilson was president of Princeton, actually, no, even before he was president, when he was a professor here, and he was, in fact, and this is an interesting part of the story, too, we didn't even have a chance to get into, and that was his health, which was not good. And he famously had this stroke in 1919. But you will see that there were, in fact, at least a dozen incidents that preceded the big stroke. There were some small strokes along the way. And when he was president of Princeton, in fact, the the trustees urged him to take a vacation for a while because they wanted him here, but they said, you need to just cool your jets and then come back. And Wilson did that. So, and Mrs. Wilson was often urging him to just to take little trips on his own, just to go, because she had 3 daughters to raise while he was away. And indeed, Wilson did go to Bermuda, where he met a very attractive, she had been widowed and was currently separated from her second husband, Mary Allen Holbert Peck. And there was an attraction, there was an immediate attraction. She was very unlike Ellen, who was a rather homespun, perfect wife. And here was this rather glamorous woman who smoked and played piano, and she was interesting. Wilson saw her several times over the years, and there was even a moment when the Wilson marriage was really hurting for various reasons, including a depression that Mrs. Wilson was then suffering. But there was this moment where Wilson was seeing Mrs. Peck by himself, quite unchaperoned, at her apartment even in New York. And it is in this period that it is often presumed they did have a full-blown love affair, a sexual affair, that is. I believe their affair was more postal than sexual. I think it was mostly through letters. There's no question in my mind it was a deep emotional affair. I don't believe it really became more than that for several reasons. I think, as I allude in the book, it was one of those occasions of sin. It was lust in his heart. I don't think he went the distance. And here are a couple of the reasons. One is Ellen always knew about this great friendship. And indeed, after the crisis moment, when Ellen was kind of out of the picture and suffering, before she had really kind of come back to the marriage, a matter of a few months, in fact, Wilson was having Mrs. Peck come up to the house. I mean, Wilson, introduced his daughters to this woman. She would take them shopping. Now, it might have been an example of hiding her in plain sight, but I just think he loved his wife too much. That's just cruel. That's just kind of twisted, even. And it just seemed so unlikely. Even accounting for the fact that he might have removed any letters that would have been incriminating, you don't even see anything that approaches something that would have suggested an affair at either end. And indeed, the letters throughout between Woodrow and Ellen Wilson were really always very passionate love letters. The letters between Wilson and Mrs. Peck, they were very newsy. I mean, they were just, they were kind of, here's what I did today and here's what I'm thinking. They got slightly personal, maybe about career and what was going on, but they were never emotional on any level. So it was just really hard for me to think that there was a physical sexual affair. As a biographer interested in selling books, I would have loved nothing more. Would have loved it. But I just honestly couldn't say it happened. And so that's why I came down on the side of purity.
Well, on that note,